Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on wildfires. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the time that you've taken from your busy schedule to join us for this. My name is Leander Tomazelli, and I serve as the account executive for multiple accounts on the West Coast. If you have any questions about property or casualty, or if you're simply in need of risk management advice, feel free to reach out to me. I will share my contact information on the chat if you have any questions. The purpose of this webinar is to become more familiar with the ways to protect your ministries and church and school assets from wildfires. Some quick announcements before we start. There will be some time at the end of the presentation to ask questions. So please send us your questions during the presentation or at the end using the chat feature on Zoom at the bottom of your screen. I now want to move things over to my colleague, Alex Stell, who is the manager for the Insurance Service Department, and he will be introducing the speaker for today.
Good morning or good afternoon. I would like to thank everyone for participating in this, in my view, very important webinar. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mark Hope, who is Guy Carpenter's subject matter expert for the risk of wildfires. He actually led the team at Guy Carpenter to develop analytical tools to better understand the risk of wildfire, which we actually used those tools in Adventist risk management. So thank you, Dr. Hope. He's also the subject matter expert for hurricane storm surge, and he used to work for AIR Worldwide, which is a leading catastrophe modeling organization. Dr. Hope earned his PhD in civil engineering from University of Notre Dame, and would like to also mention a few words about Guy Carpenter. Guy Carpenter is a partner of ours for many decades, and they help us to secure reinsurance. And very simply, explain it very simply, reinsurance is insurance for insurance companies, and it is very important for us. And they have never failed us, even after severe losses, including from wildfires. So would like to thank the Guy Carpenter team, and thank you, Dr. Hope. And without any further ado, would like to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex, for the very nice introduction. Very happy to be here to speak with everyone today. I think what about a very prescient topic that I think is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, which is wildfire. Now, admittedly, I think I'm giving away the thesis of my discussion here today on the first slide, but really, if there's anything to take away from today, is that wildfire is truly a uniquely human peril. As we'll see, there's a lot of human interaction and a lot of facets of wildfire, both from the hazard perspective, but from the resiliency perspective, where humans play a really big role. And we don't really see that with the other perils that we think about when we think about natural catastrophes, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the severe convective storms of the world. So again, if there's anything to take away, it's the fact of how kind of inherently linked wildfire is with human and human behavior. So there's really three main sections I'd like to go through today. Really, one is a background of wildfire science. I think without that background of wildfire science, the wildfire resiliency and how we protect our structures and communities, it's really necessary to understand, I'll say, maybe not the nuts and bolts, but maybe the broader strokes of wildfire science. We'll then get into wildfire resiliency, which I think is the topic that most people will be very interested in today. How do we protect our communities, both in terms of the whole community as a whole, but our individual structures, our churches, our homes, our businesses? How do we protect those from wildfire when a wildfire is encroaching on the community, but also in the weeks and months before wildfires may start up in an area? And finally, a little bit of a short discussion, I'd say, around how climate change is influencing wildfire. It's a question I think we're hearing, or I'm certainly hearing a lot more frequently, is what does the future of wildfire look like? Because even the present of wildfire looks very different than the past of wildfire, the recent past, maybe 10 to 20 years ago or so. So my goal here today is, and it probably won't even take 20 minutes, but I hope everybody can walk away from at least the first 15 minutes of today feeling like they're an expert in wildfire science. So if you go back to your university level or maybe even high school level chemistry class, you might remember the fire triangle. In order for there to be combustion, a fire of any kind, you need three elements. You need oxygen, heat, and fuel. There's a somewhat analogous triangle for wildfire. What drives a large wildfire? Well, there's also three elements. You need fuels of some sort, anything that burns in our wildfire sense. It's grasses, it's trees, it's scrubland. You need some sort of topography. Wildfires tend to spread much quicker and much more intensely up slopes, and they move a little bit slower going down slopes. And finally, weather, right? We need something to drive the conditions that are conducive to wildfires. We usually think about that in terms of the humidity of an area, but a lot of times it's the heat and the wind on the day of a potential ignition. And kind of on the sides of these triangles here, I sort of noted what the order of timing in terms of how these different elements change. Right, the fuels that burn, if you think about grasses, those can dry out rather quickly if you're not frequently watering or irrigating them. So fuels can change on the order of maybe 10 to 24 hours or so. Whereas if you think of at the opposite end of the spectrum, a redwood forest, it takes a really long time for very large, thick trees to kind of dry out and suffer from drought conditions. So fuels change or evolve, I'll say, on an order of maybe days to months, even years for really, really large fuels. Topography is truly the shape of the earth, right? That's not changing very much. You were talking about maybe literally geological scales, but also in terms of what is on the landscape, right? Has a forest been reclaimed and been developed as a residential area? Has a parking lot been reclaimed as wildland area, right? Things do change maybe on the order of years to decades in terms of what are we developing or what is kind of returning back to nature. And finally, in terms of the weather, right, weather patterns change on I'll say an hours to maybe a week-long basis, right? We've seen extended heat waves in parts of the country and parts of the world over the last couple of weeks that maybe last 4 or 5 days. But also there's really short wind events. A front moves through and you'll have wind gusts up to 50 miles an hour that maybe last for only 1 to 2 to 3 hours, but those can have a significant influence on wildfire as well. So really one of the first of many, I'll say, complicating factors around wildfire is that there's lots and lots of different processes that occur on very different timescales that influence wildfire. Thinking about the distances, what scales of distance, I should say, influence wildfire. Those are also very, very large and can vary greatly, right? What's the difference in weather, say, between Boise, Idaho and Los Angeles, California? There's different seasonal wind patterns. There's different seasonal rain patterns. The maximum minimum temperature can be very different, right? So we'll talk about maybe hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles difference, right? That's what defines what I'll call the regional scale wildfire risk profile. If we think more about our neighborhood scale, right, maybe a couple miles across or a couple kilometers across, we're thinking about, the east side of a community versus the west side of the community. What are the exact plant types on the east side of the community versus the left side of the community? How densely developed is the area? Is it really densely developed, or there's homes and businesses really close to one another, or is it a little bit more spread out? Is it more of our suburban landscape? Wildfire risk really can vary depending on those factors as well. So you can see a difference in wildfire risk over, again, 1 to 2 to maybe miles or kilometers even. That's our neighborhood scale wildfire risk. And perhaps most importantly, we think about what is on the ground at a site of interest, right? If I look out my window here, am I looking at a parking lot, which would be considered a relatively lower wildfire risk profile? Or am I looking at a really densely forested area? Am I at the top of a slope? As I mentioned before, wildfire really likes to burn upslope. Am I on a south-facing slope? If you're in the northern hemisphere, the sun dries out those south-facing slopes a lot more than the north-facing slopes. There's all of these very small-scale parameters that are really at your home or business kind of scale that dictate wildfire risk as well. So we call these kind of plots, it's an onion plot, right? You kind of peel away and understand what that first layer of risk is. Well, what's your neighborhood scale of risk? Once you identify that, we peel it away. What's your site scale risk? So again, to maybe drive home how complex of a peril wildfire is, it occurs on these very different time and space scales as well. Wildfire very generally breaks out to be kind of two different sources of wildfire. So the image I have zoomed in here is kind of for Western Canada, but we have purple dots, we have gold dots. The purple dots are naturally caused wildfire. The gold dots are human caused wildfire. Those are two general sources of wildfire. And what's really interesting is if we look here, the purple dots tend to be in much more isolated, remote areas. Those are lightning strikes. Those are naturally caused wildfires that are essentially only lightning strikes. But then we look at, you can kind of connect the dots between roads and some of these more remote rural communities. And you can see the edges of the more populated areas. There's a lot of gold. The idea of wildfire being a uniquely human peril is it's humans starting all of these gold dot fires, basically. So in the US and Canada, it varies depending exactly on the region, but it's anywhere from 40 to 60%, about half or so wildfires are started by humans. Mostly not intentionally, fortunately. It's the case of a campfire or a cigarette butt, or you're towing a boat and the chains are dragging behind your car or truck. It's a lot of these human-caused fires, but they do account for about half of the fires that we do see on the landscape in the country and really across the continent. Something else that I found very striking when I was first learning about wildfire science many years ago is you tend to think of wildfire as a Western peril, right? We think a lot about California, maybe Oregon and Washington, some other states in recent years. But really anywhere that there is fuel, you have fire. So what we see here is a map of the United States. These are all of the wildfires that have been observed since 2000. Now, some of these are absolutely tiny. They're less than an acre. Some of these are gigantic. Some of these are greater than 100,000 or 500,000 acres. The color coding we see here, again, it's different ignition sources. The pale blue that you see in this area that's rather dominant, those are your naturally caused or lightning fires. But literally everything else, the golds, the oranges, the reds, the purples, those are human-caused fires. There's some mapping artifacts. There's not some very unique fire type in Louisiana, just how it got plotted. But it's literally a 50-state issue. Certainly it's at the forefront of our minds in the Western United States, but wildfires happen every single state in the country. And again, maybe not as severe, not as frequent, but they do occur everywhere. Which one of the stranger wildfires I'll say I've seen in the last few years was I woke up on the morning of, it looks like January 15th of this year, and there was an evacuation going on in Nebraska. A rural town in Nebraska was being evacuated due to a wildfire. Nebraska is an area we don't think of being particularly exposed to wildfire, but again, going back, certainly there's a fire history within Nebraska, and it was severe enough because of some rather strong anomalous winds and some low relative humidities. A fire broke out in this town of Benkelman, Nebraska, had to be evacuated. Now, fortunately, the impacts were very limited. I don't think any structures were lost to this fire, but it was this kind of reminder again that wildfire is a very frequent peril, and it really happens everywhere, even in January, even in Nebraska. So when we think of fire on the landscape, when we think of wildfire, how does it move? How does it get from one place to another? And there's really three main modes of fire movement. There's your ground fire. That's probably what a lot of people think of, or at least what I thought of initially about wildfire. It's a grass fire creeping across the surface. This picture in the upper left, I think, is a really good visualization of that. Ground fires tend to be a little bit lower intensity. They're easier to control, right? Men and women can literally maybe not run up these fires, but they can approach these fires and attack them, whether with water, they can dig those physical fire breaks. Ground fires certainly can be nasty, but they are approachable from a suppression sense. Now, crown fire is where through a ladder of fuels, we'll call it, a ground fire kind of creeps up into the canopy of the forest and starts jumping truly from tree to tree. Can't really do that in the picture on the upper left here because the trees are spread out enough. But when you have a really dense, thick kind of coniferous or boreal forest, the fire can jump from tree to tree. These are really nasty. You think if you look out in the forest, there's a lot of fuel. There's a lot of biomass up in those trees in the canopy. So once a fire becomes a crown fire, it's very intense. And you can kind of see that here because the fire front is moving one direction. It looks like the wind's moving in another direction. And that's because the fire is so intense from the crown fire that it's actually generating its own wind patterns, which is a whole very challenging factor from a modeling perspective. But crown fires are really nasty. We don't want men and women approaching those on the ground to attack a crown fire. Once a fire becomes a crown fire, that's when you start to see those big water bombers and helicopters dropping water on these fires. Crown fires are where we begin to get more worried about exactly what the effect of a fire is going to be. And finally, there's also ember ignition. I do have a couple more interesting pictures of ember ignition, but I kind of created this one on my own. Right, once we have that crown fire, and you have these strong wind patterns either being generated by the fire itself or being generated on the weather that day, right? If you've ever stood around a campfire, you've certainly seen an ember ignition in transport. You hear that fire crackle, and you see some embers kind of dance upwards into the sky. Think about that at a campfire, but on a massive scale, right? We've seen embers from wildfires anywhere from the size of your thumbnail to maybe the size of your entire forearm. And they can be generated and launched many, many miles, I would say. We've seen anywhere from 1 to 2 miles, some very rare cases of even greater than that. But this becomes very challenging from both trying to understand fire moving, but also from suppressing it, because you might be fighting a fire in one location, but ember might be generated and it might be transported to another location. So now you have another fire known as a spot fire that's away from where we were initially looking. So these different motions are very challenging. Again, one of the more interesting things we see with wildfire is we've talked about, right, the hundreds of miles of difference from Boise, Idaho to Los Angeles, California, and how the weather can dictate how different fire behavior is. Again, kind of on a daily basis, maybe during the summer and sometimes in January in Nebraska, I'll look up and see what is the wildfire activity for that day. So this is about 3 years ago or so, right? September is when we're starting to get into peak wildfire season for California. So there's this Delta fire, which is pretty close to Redding, California, that we see here at the bottom of the image. And so this rather large fire broke out. I was reading through the description that we see here, and something caught my eye, was that they were talking about 300-foot flame lengths. I surely thought that was a miscommunication or a misprint, right? That's a building's worth of fire, basically, a skyscraper's worth of fire. It was just unimaginable to me. But I went out and read a few more reports from a few different sources, and they were all listing a 300-foot flame length. And sure enough, this was such an intense, large fire being driven by extreme meteorological conditions. There was a 300-foot flame length. It's so hard to imagine that, because you think about, again, if we go back to our campfire, maybe that's a 3-foot flame length. And if you've ever stood next to a campfire, it burns pretty intensely. And campfires certainly can get out of control and can burn down structures. So the idea of there being wildfires that have 300-foot flame lengths it's very challenging to A, defend against, and B, to just really to think about it, if we want to model how fire is moving across the landscape. 300-foot flame length is just simply gigantic. So again, this adds to the complexity of, you can have a fire that's, a campfire's length 3 feet that could destroy a structure, but you could have 300-foot flames as well. The size of fires varies differently as well. We think about fires in terms of how big they are, how many acres is a fire. And so I haven't named these fires that we see on the slide here, but they are two very notable fires. What we have on the left side here is actually the Oakland Hills or Tunnel Fire from 1991. Up until a couple of years ago, this was one of the most damaging fires in California history in terms of structures lost. It destroyed nearly 3,000 structures in 1991. On the right side here, we have what is now the largest fire in California history, the August Complex from last summer. That was the first, they call it Giga Fire. It was the first fire over 1 million acres in California. But it destroyed 935 structures. I don't want to say only 935 structures, because that's still a significant loss. But the idea of, you could have one fire that's as big as the August Complex we see here, and one that's the size of the Oakland Hills fire, which is in purple in the middle here. I kind of superimposed the two, that they could destroy very different numbers of structures, right? Just how big a fire is in terms of the acres doesn't necessarily mean how impactful it was. So it's another bit that you have to think about a little bit more for wildfires. Big fires don't necessarily mean big impact. It certainly can, but it's not always the case. Now, comparing wildfire to other natural perils that are out there, we think of wildfire as what we call a high gradient peril. I could be on my side of the street in my home, and my home may be relatively unaffected by a wildfire, but my neighbor across the street might have their home destroyed. It's just how fire behaves. Something might have changed in the time that a fire was approaching my home. The wind changed direction, the heat of the fire diminished, but you can have very, very different results on different sides of the street. If you compare that to, say, earthquake or hurricane, right? If you're across the street from your neighbor, you and your neighbor probably aren't experiencing very different wind speeds. If it's a hurricane and it's hurricane force winds in your neighborhood, kind of everybody in the neighborhood is going to experience the same wind speed. It's very different for wildfire. And again, it can be very concentrated in terms of where the damage and where the most intense part of the fire occurs. But as you mentioned before, kind of we did an interesting experiment of trying to get a sense of if a notable hurricane, in this case Hurricane Harvey, if that hit Los Angeles, it's impossible. But we wanted to get a sense of, right, what would the wind footprint look like compared to a fire footprint? Just the hurricane force winds over land of Hurricane Harvey were 4 million acres. Again, the single largest fire in California history was only 1 million acres. So it's a very, very different, I would say, paradigm of how one location can get affected different than another location that may be very close to one another. Now, before I jump to the next slide, I'll ask a question and say, where do you think the largest fire in North American history ever occurred? Largest fire in California history is 1 million acres or so. So where was the largest in North American history? This is a little bit of a callback to something we mentioned before. If you guessed New Brunswick, Canada, I will be very, very impressed. And that is because it's the idea of fires can occur anywhere there are fuels. And about almost 200 years ago or so, there was a nearly 4 million acre fire in Eastern Canada. Very different fuel landscape, very different treatment of fire, I'll say 200 years ago as compared to today. But again, it gets that idea in our minds of, fires can really occur anywhere that we have those wildland fuels. Now, I apologize for the math that we see here, but I wanted to go back to a little bit to that fire triangle that we mentioned before. And I had it depicted as a very nice, equilateral, all sides are the same triangle. What we've really begun to understand maybe in the last 10 to 20 years or so is for wildfires, it's not a nice equilateral triangle. That weather part is really what drives the fires that we worry about and that we defend against. I'll say that the math here just kind of points out that when we consider wind in terms of how fire is encroaching across the landscape, it's exponential. So if you have a 10-mile-an-hour wind and a 20-mile-an-hour wind, that 20-mile-an-hour wind is going to drive fire much, much further than the 10-mile-an-hour wind. And right, we have events in California where we have 90+ mile-an-hour winds in some of the mountain passes, right? It's anytime we see an anomalous wind event or a strong wind event in a wildfire-prone area, that's when we have to start thinking about preparing in the immediate term for a wildfire. So in terms of both of, the ground fire, the fire creeping across the landscape, right, moves much faster and higher winds, but also here's the image of embers that I was thinking of, right? The higher the wind speed, the more embers we're generating, the farther they're going. I really can't get over this. I find this image so striking of any one of those embers could land on a structure and potentially ignite that structure. And you're talking about a fire that generates quite literally billions of embers. Now, one of the problems we have with wildfire, and this is a slide that I stole from one of the leading researchers at the U.S. Forest Service a couple of years ago, I really liked it, is that really our knowledge of how wildfire moves across the landscape, we have some equations, we have some general ideas, but really they're all based on lab testing. It's not really based so much on actually observing fire on the landscape. Part of that is it's really challenging to, I'd say, accurately observe and measure fire movement across the landscape. But he used this analogy of, the technology we have is really good. We can go out and hop on Amazon or buy a computing server. We can have a ton of kind of computational power behind us, but really our fundamental knowledge of how wildfire interacts with structures, how it moves across the landscape, how embers are transported, it's really not that robust as compared to some of the other perils that we think about. There's lots and lots of research has been done around hurricanes and seismic events, and certainly there's some uncertainty around how we model those. But at this point, really, our technology far outstrips our knowledge in terms of how to model wildfire. So I'll begin transitioning a bit out of the science part into, right, how do we defend our homes and our structures that we care about from wildfire? And again, it becomes very challenging. And I think this picture is a really good illustration of that difference of quite literally what I'll say the other side of the street problem. This is from a fire in Colorado in 2012. And literally, you have I won't say undamaged because there's likely some aesthetic or smoke damage to the structures on this side of the street. But right, everything across the street here is completely destroyed. Even right next to the homes that are intact, there are homes that are completely destroyed. There's a little bit of I don't know, a gully there, I'll call it. Homes on the other side are destroyed, right? Why did this home survive? Why did this home get destroyed? It's really hard to tell this after the fact, but there are some things we can do, and we'll get into that far more in depth in a few slides. But again, looking at this picture, it's hard to comprehend in some ways, how do we get this accurate, whether we're trying to model it from a loss perspective, or just how do we know what works and what doesn't work in terms of protecting our homes and our structures against wildfire? To illustrate this a little bit further, there was a large fire in Fort McMurray, Canada, 5 years ago or so, May 2016. And Fort McMurray is somewhat of a unique community. It's a very forested community, relatively new community for the most part, but really kind of on all sides of it is very thick forest. And we saw very similar behavior. This is a map from a Google crisis map that immediately after the event, and surveyed and identified which structures were destroyed and which ones survived. And it's a very irregular pattern, I would say, right? Everything in green survived, everything in red was completely destroyed. And right, you have areas that were directly up against a heavily forested area that burned, and you're across the street from that, and some of these structures survived. There's this island here that really has no direct exposure to the wildlands, but it didn't survive. Every house on this block was destroyed. So again, it's this very challenging interplay of how close are you to some of those wildlands, how far are the embers going, but also what does your structure look like? How have you defended against it? How is the community prepared for this wildfire? These sort of human elements play a really, really big role. Again, the last bit here before we get into, well, what do we do about this? How do we increase our resiliency? What we've seen is, and this is again this human interplay. These numbers are a little bit dated from 1990 to 2010, but we've seen, say, California's population grew by 25%. Population in the WUI, the WUI, what we call the wildland urban interface, kind of those areas directly between our populated areas and our wildlands, grew even more. While WUI population grew 35% or so. And then we have some details about Butte County, which is where Paradise was. People really want to live in wildfire prone areas. And I get it. They tend to be beautiful. They tend to be relaxing. But so we have this kind of feedback loop of people want to go live in really beautiful areas, but people also cause fires in those very beautiful areas, as we've seen. So right, we have to think about how, as communities, as humans in the world, how do we stop wildfires before they start, but also at some point they are inevitable. Lots and lots of wildfires can be a good thing because they are a natural force on the planet and on the landscape. So how do we properly manage, maybe not prevent, but how do we properly manage wildfire? Because they are going to occur. All right, wildfire resiliency. So we've kind of demonstrated wildfires are going to happen. They happen a lot. Humans can cause them. How do we, A, maybe stop causing them as much, but maybe B, also they're going to happen. How do we defend our homes and communities? So I'm going to go back to my favorite thing here. We're going to go back to another onion plot. We're going to think about the many scales of wildfire again. So thinking on that same scale, right, our regional scale, what does regional resiliency look like? These are pretty big plans. These are wildland management plans. These are event response tactics. These are controlled burns. These are, federal scale, county scale, state scale sort of programs that look at the longer term. How do we manage the wildlands? How do we manage development in these wildlands? These are obviously things that humans decide on, and humans shape these plans. But again, that's a very, very broad scale. That's something that a large organization would tackle. When we get to the neighborhood scale, I think this is where this group today really can start to enact resiliency. So there are some, I would say, formal community resiliency programs that I'll detail in a little bit, known as FireWise or FireSmart, depending on where you're at exactly. But those are programs that really are about community education, but then community action as well. It's about every member of the community doing something to their home to make their home and then subsequently their community much more resilient. And really, education is a huge bit. Thank you to everyone today for attending this talk, because I think just the education bit of understanding, hey, me, Mark, I can go out camping, and if I don't put out my campfire, I could cause a big wildfire, is a really important thing to start to ingrain into people's minds. And finally, that site scale, right? Again, I look out my window and I see what maybe my wildfire risk is. Well, what can I do to mitigate that risk? Everything from looking at combustible material around my home to making sure there's plenty of space between my home and the road where a fire suppression crew might come in, and really how it's consistent or constant, or maybe constant maintenance to protect that individual structure. So at this point, I'll say that a lot of the material we'll see comes from the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. We call it the IBHS. Guy Carpenter is kind of a partner or a member of IBHS, but it is a completely public-facing organization, though I have the website here and on a lot of the subsequent slides. I would say they are the premier institution in terms of understanding and mitigating risk from natural hazards, wildfire being one of them. They have, I'll say, I've borrowed a lot of the material I'll be talking about for the rest of today from them, but they really, from a research perspective and then from an application perspective, cannot be beat in terms of the suggestions they have and the prioritizations that they have for wildfire. So a couple of maybe some of the basic illustrations that they employ, again, is this idea of it's kind of the same almost onion plot that we see here, right? You want to almost break up your site, the area around your structure, your church, your school, into different zones, and you want to treat those zones very differently. You think about the first 5 to 30 feet or so. You really want that to be totally clear of anything that can burn. You don't want to be stacking up wooden pallets or piles of yard waste. If you're raking the leaves, don't leave that pile of leaves directly next to your structure. You want really nothing that can combust within that first 5 to 30 feet or so. But again, that can be challenging, right? Not everybody has 5 to 30 feet around their structures. So this is the idea of, right, your neighboring property, your neighbors are part of the conversation as well. So the structural scale kind of directly leads to that community scale. You have to think about it in 3 dimensions as well, right? I mentioned before a little bit about the ladder of fuels and how, ground fires certainly are troubling, but ground fires, when you get up into the canopy, those are the ones that we really worry about. So we think about, kind of the 2D of, okay, the first 5 to 30 feet or so around my structure. But we also want to make sure that around our structure, we don't have grasses that lead to bushes, that lead to shrubs, that lead to trees. That gives fire a pathway to get up into the crown or the canopy. And that's when the fire becomes really challenging from a suppression standpoint. So there's this vertical component also to how we want to defend the areas around our structure. I really like this image from the IBHS. This is a paradigm that I've mentioned, and it seems a little hyperbolic maybe, but a weekend's worth of yard work around a structure can really, really make your structure more resilient to wildfire. It can also make it much more vulnerable to wildfire as well if you don't kind of follow the protocols properly. But there are a ton of DIY, do-it-yourself projects for wildfire preparedness, right? The idea of creating defensible space. I think they talk about 3 zones. Roofs and gutters, as we saw a couple slides ago, that image of all of those embers blowing around, hundreds of millions, if not billions of embers, right? All it takes for a structure to be destroyed potentially is a single ember, the size of your fingernail. If you have a lot of debris in a gutter or accumulated on the roof of a structure or in kind of a nook or cranny of a structure, all it takes is a single ember to ignite, and that may be the difference between a structure surviving or not. So it's this routine kind of maintenance and removal of debris and making sure there aren't flammable materials accruing in areas of around a structure. Things like garage doors, right? You want structures to be basically impenetrable to those embers, which seems very challenging, again, because of the sheer scale of those embers. But making sure vents on screens that have a fine enough mesh that embers can't get through, that vents on your roof or on the sides of your homes are, again, a fine enough mesh to not let embers in. Decks and porches and patios, right? It might not be possible to kind of totally block them off, but you certainly don't want debris accruing and accumulating underneath those decks and patios. And again, it's a community process. It's a little bit of an overstatement to say that my home is only as safe as my neighbor's home, because if my neighbor is right next to me and their home catches on fire, my home doesn't stand much of a chance. But it's a collective resiliency that needs to be built. The IBHS has done a really good job of taking these, I would say, structural scale resiliency measures and broken them up kind of into tiers. And this is not, if you get the alert on your phone in the middle of the night, these are not exactly the things to think of at that point in time. But right, if you have a couple months to start to think and plan your wildfire resiliency plan, these are kind of the tiers of actions that you can and should take. And some of them are admittedly very, very complicated and potentially costly, right? Building a fire-resistant deck or upgrading the windows of a structure, that's a rather large investment. But that's also why this would be considered kind of a tier 4. Start at the tier 1 bits, the things that are much more approachable on a shorter time scale and might not cost as much either. Again, I'll give a terrific plug for the IBHS, and it's literally www.disastersafety.org. They have a wealth of material. It's really fantastic stuff. But I've gotten the question before, like, there's all these actions that we can take to defend our structures from wildfire. How do we know that they work, right? Some of it seems rather intuitive, but how do we know that these are actually effective? And I'll say again, for the IBHS, they have a huge lab in rural South Carolina that's basically a gigantic wind tunnel where they can build full-size structures and test them for basically they launch hailstones at them to understand how roofs respond to hail. They blow 100-mile-an-hour winds at structures to simulate hurricanes. And they do the exact same for wildfire. I've had the pleasure of being not in the room. We can't stand in the room, but there's an observation deck to stand around. And it's a little tough to see, but you can kind of see in the corner here, they can build the structure. They blast embers at it about 30 miles an hour or so. And the left side is kind of what not to do for building a home for wildfire. They have mulch all the way around the structure. It's wood tiles on the siding. It's not a fire resistant roof. It's single pane windows. Kind of if you followed none of their instructions in terms of constructing and maintaining a home, it would be the left side. Whereas the right side is kind of following all of the best practices in terms of construction, but also in terms of maintenance. And they've done this experiment several times at this point, and every single time the end result is that the left side catches on fire and the right side does not. For all the uncertainty that I spoke about in the first section about wildfire, about how chaotic of a peril it is, and how do you capture and model millions of embers striking a structure, and it's a very challenging peril to capture accurately within a model. This is such a perfect demonstration of, yes, it's a challenging peril, but the human resiliency, the human aided resiliency, this is the difference. It's literally two homes right next to one another. One is good, one is bad from a vulnerability standpoint. And the good side has literally never burned, and the bad side is burned every single time. It's as empirical of evidence exists for how we as individuals can defend our structures from wildfire. So zooming out a little bit from the individual structures level, there is a neighborhood scale, right? And then again, individual structures can make up a neighborhood, and the individual structures certainly aid the neighborhood level resiliency. But there are some, again, more formal programs around neighborhood scale resiliency. They mostly fall under Firewise USA, which is part of the NFPA, which is the National Fire. I'm blanking on the acronym. I apologize. NFPA is the parent organization of Firewise USA. And this is a really, really fantastic and thorough program that is all about getting out into the community and talking to people and educating homeowners, business owners, the people in the community, those individual structural best practices that we saw from the IBHS, but also the emergency planning of the community of how are we going to respond, in the hours before a wildfire? How are we going to respond in the weeks and months before wildfire season? It really is a community level program, and it's a specific designation. There are communities that are considered fire-wise, and the NFPA kind of designates these communities. So it takes a bit of action. It takes motivation. It takes time, certainly, to be able to go out and become a Firewise certified community. But it's for every community that becomes more Firewise, right? Every community becomes more resilient to wildfire. And so it works across many, many scales. It's a community level resiliency, not in the sense of the entire city of Chicago, Illinois is not Firewise, would be considered a Firewise community, but it's more of a neighborhood scale of subdivisions of certain communities, and certain areas of communities are Firewise. They're terrifically helpful in terms of how to get out and reach out and educate people. It's a really, really impressive program, and one that I certainly cannot suggest enough to be involved in. National Fire Protection Association. Thank you. Someone in the Q&A popped it in there. I appreciate it. even beyond the FireWise community, the FireWise program, I should say, is more about adaptation of current communities to wildfire. And I think it's becoming more and more important as we progress and as we're seeing more areas affected by wildfire, or areas that were previously affected by wildfire being affected more often. This is definitely a different approach that we're seeing, but the idea of shelter-in-place communities, we hear that term for some other natural perils as well. But we are at the point where this started outside of San Diego, maybe a decade or 15 years ago or so. But truly designing communities to be wildfire, I would say resilient, not wildfire proof, but making sure roadways and driveways are enough to accommodate traffic in case of needing to transport in large firefighting equipment, making sure there's redundancy in water supplies, understanding the vegetation within the neighborhood to have wildfire resistant or wildfire proof vegetation. Again, this is more from a developing communities perspective, but there is an idea of, we don't always run from wildfire. Certainly in most cases we do and we want to, but there are ways to truly construct communities that are wildfire resilient, in the sense of we can build a new community in a way. Again, a little bit different paradigm, certainly from the FireWise bit, and most communities aim for FireWise, but there is this, I would say, evolution in thinking around wildfire, that it's something that is going to occur whether we want it to or not. So how do we make our new communities adaptable to it? So I'll close out with the last 5 minutes or so, sort of with what does the future look like, both in the immediate and long term for wildfire. And what's interesting for wildfire is that depending on what we'll call the moisture constraints and fire climate of a region, increasing temperature and increasing precipitation might have very different effects on wildfire going forward. So I'm taking two very, very divergent and different examples here. One of Death Valley, which we would consider to be a moisture-limited landscape, and the Everglades of Florida, which would be considered a moisture-rich landscape. Generally, you don't have to go too far. I mean, the Everglades is a pretty active fire landscape, and you don't have to go too far from Death Valley for there to be active fire landscape. So they're both, I would say, wildfire-exposed areas. If Death Valley somehow got hotter than it is today, there really wouldn't be much effect on the wildfire activity in the area, because there's not a whole lot to burn in Death Valley if you've ever been there. So increasing temperature really wouldn't have too much effect on wildfire. Increasing precipitation actually would create more fuels. Things would green up a bit. If you've ever been there or been in that region after a very wet winter, you get those super bloom springs, lots and lots of new flowers and grasses that bloom. So increased precipitation would actually increase fire activity within Death Valley. Compare that to the Everglades, where increased temperature would actually dry out kind of the fuels that already exist there, because it's a pretty frequent fire landscape there. So increased temperature kind of dries out the fuels that exist. We would expect more frequent and more intense fires. If increased precipitation occurred in the Everglades, things would actually be kind of greener. We would have increased moistures that would result in decreased wildfire activity. Now, none of these factors happen alone, Increasing temperature alone without increasing precipitation likely doesn't occur. But it speaks again to sort of the complexities of, increased temperature doesn't automatically correlate to increased wildfire activity. In general, what we can expect to see based on modeling is that we will have kind of in most of the country more days more days that will be conducive to, I would say, large or active wildfire behavior. Those are kind of the oranges and the reds here. Although it isn't everywhere, based on kind of the model that we see here, California and the West, really the West Coast, isn't expected to see really a whole lot more in terms of days, but also that you have to remember that they already have a pretty long and persistent fire season as is. So maybe we'll see increased activity in other parts of the US. Again, not to really hammer home the idea of how complex everything is, but for Southern California, when we're concerned about wildfire, we think about the Santa Ana winds, those really strong, hot, dry winds that happen kind of in the late fall and into the winter in California. And so for California, maybe it's not so much about exactly the longer term weather projections we see here, but it's about, how are the Santa Ana winds going to change under climate change conditions going forward? And there are some projections around that, but again, it's a very complex interaction of how are temperature and precipitation going to change, but then how are these really localized variables like the Southern California Santa Ana winds going to change as well. So I said this section is about climate change, but I'm actually going to close on a note that is not decisively not climate change. So again, we talked about increasing population, in we'll say urban, suburban, exurban areas. It's an unfortunate kind of feedback loop of, right, we have more people moving to these beautiful wildland urban interface areas or these beautiful rural areas. But as we saw and demonstrated, people cause fires. It's just a really unfortunate part of humans being out in these wildlands. So not only going forward are we going to have really more value and more people in these exposed areas, but consequently because of that, we're going to have more fires. So there is this, I think the educational perspective, and I put Smoky Bear here because, right, it's only you can prevent wildfires, only you can prevent forest fires. So it's this idea of, educating people that, again, any individual attending the call today, even if they have no intent of doing so or not, and surely they don't, but they could be the source of the wildfire. So it's just, really making sure your campfires are out and making sure you're not flicking a cigarette butt out the window. And it really is important to, I can't go out and I can't cause an earthquake. I can't go out and I can't cause a hurricane, but I can go out and cause a wildfire. And that idea of humans causing, big natural disasters is something we haven't thought about, but have to start thinking about. And certainly while kind of the climate indicators show we'll see increases in sort of conducive wildfire conditions, we can fight back against that, both literally and figuratively, right? We're getting better in terms of technologies for suppressing wildfires, detecting them quickly and suppressing them. There was a period last fall, I believe, that was 6 or 7 straight days of what were considered extreme wildfire conditions for Southern California. And my colleagues and I were very nervous that we were going to be in for a very challenging week in terms of responding and reporting wildfires. And certainly there was wildfire activity, but nothing truly catastrophic came of that week. And we kind of, as we were reading about it afterwards, it was a really impressive period of a fire was detected and it was immediately suppressed, and the organization around how that fire was attacked. So the technology around how we suppress and attack fire and then hopefully extinguish it is certainly evolving. But kind of as the climate conditions change, and we will see, again, more conducive wildfire conditions, is this idea of the education and the planning that I think will really, really make a difference. And again, going back to that onion plot, it's the resiliency from your home to your community to really your region is what's really going to defend, and I think hopefully make wildfire a manageable peril from a risk perspective. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that have come in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hope. The presentation was fantastic. A lot to learn about wildfires. I was certainly impressed with the amount of information that we can start, taking to our churches and schools. In fact, our audience have a variety of administrators from conferences, the local churches, local school leaders. If you could advise a leader, a local church or school leader, in simple steps, simple things to do. In fact, that's one of the questions that we have. What would be that first push that you would tell a local church leader to start doing right away?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really I would take almost that tiered approach. And I think the first thing I would approach is right, looking at and this is more literal of an interpretation than you intended, but looking at that first foot, taking that first step outside of your church or out of your structure, and looking and saying, what do we have immediately adjacent to our church? Is it bushes? Is it rock mulch? Is it mulch? Right? It's what we've seen kind of in the studies post-event are the structures that have nothing immediately adjacent to them. Those are the ones that have more likelihood to survive, I would say. And so, right, the idea of those different scales of resiliency, it's that the first foot, the first 6 inches, however you want to define it. Understanding exactly what can you do with those first 6 inches or first 18 inches, whatever it is. What can you do to tidy that up, to make sure that there isn't anything that a fire can't just run up right to your structure, because that's really what you want to avoid. And so it's looking at your buildings and understanding what can we do the first foot, and really it kind of is that one small step is really the first progression you can take. Beyond that, I think it's the idea of, we've seen so many fires that have been caused by humans. There's really the most unfortunate example. There's a fire from California a few years ago. That was, somebody had a hot tub on a deck that was, overlooking a beautiful mountain view, and it wasn't wired properly, and it caused a spark, and that started a wildfire. But again, it's the idea of, like, nobody would ever connect the dots between a hot tub and a wildfire, but it's the idea of, really almost so many different activities that we do recreationally can result in something really, really disastrous. And so there's an idea of, I can't think of the word, but it's a really idealistic thing to say, I want to do everything I can to not harm the members of the community around me. And then that's a perfect ethos to have all the time. But to think about it in a wildfire, in a natural disaster context, and, my actions can directly lead to the harm of others and doing it via a wildfire. It's probably not something we think about too commonly, but it's something that actually does happen.
Very good. Thank you. I like the idea of taking the small steps at a time. And sometimes we tend to believe there's not much we can do about wildfire, but there's actually, baby steps that we can start taking, identifying the risk, going outside, looking at the structure, and looking at things that we can implement. And then as a church board, as church leaders, we can bring that information back to the leadership and talk about the different levels of resources, investment that we can put on and make the next step in the right direction. So.
Yep. Yeah. I think as was mentioned before, kind of the other hat that I tend to wear is for hurricane storm surge risk. And in terms of, building a more resilient community or more resilient structure to flood risk, it's literally building a flood wall in most cases, which is, a huge engineering undertaking that costs millions, if not billions of dollars. And so certainly, I think people tend to think of big resiliency measures as these huge investments and these huge time investments. And again, as you mentioned, like for wildfire, there are some very, I don't want to say minimal because it does take effort, but there are some very achievable steps, I'll say, to building resilient structures and then consequently building more resilient communities.
Thank you, Dr. Hope. And for everyone joining, you can use the chat for the Q&A. Please send us any questions that you have. There is one question that came up, Dr. Mark, is we usually hear that wildfires happen on the West Coast. That's usually what's on the news. But we do see, based on your presentation, that wildfires happen all around the country. So would you say the risk management ideas and suggestions that we talked about is something that all buildings, all structures in the nation could benefit from? This is something that applies for everybody, correct?
Yep. Yeah, it's best practices. Generally for wildfire, best practices are best practices, whether you're in Los Angeles, whether you're in Vermont, kind of wherever you may be that's wildfire exposed. There's maybe different prioritizations you could take in certain areas. I'll say a quick example that jumps to mind is we talk about how dangerous embers can be and ember spread. Right, if you're in a grassland exposed area, I guess I'm thinking kind of the Great Plains. Embers exist still, but they usually aren't sort of the main mechanism, I would say, to ignition. It is that sort of run up of fire across the ground into a structure. So right, maybe you prioritize, the prevention of a ground fire encroaching a structure more than resisting embers. But again, it is a very much best practices are best practices. Again, it's not like ground fires or embers don't exist in Nebraska. They maybe are more prevalent in California and the West. But I think in general, best practices are best practices. There's whatever you're doing in California will certainly be effective in Vermont, type of thing. I want to be very careful because I don't want to discourage anyone from doing anything, because again, any step you take to become more resilient does make you more resilient. So I want to choose my words very carefully, that anything you do is beneficial. But again, those maybe depending exactly where you're at, some like that tiered approach that I showed would vary a little bit.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Hope. We appreciate your time. Let's see if we have more questions here. So we have a question about mentioning a go bag keeping your gas tank in your car at least half full. So doing some preventative measures prior to a wildfire coming, that's a good risk management approach when it comes to wildfire.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's, wildfire is a bit more analogous to I would say, tornado or severe thunderstorm risk than it would be for hurricane, right? Hurricane evacuations usually get, I would say, days notice, maybe not total full days, but wildfire is very much, you get probably minutes to an hours or so notice. And so, right, it's, again, this difference in time scales that we mentioned a few times, is you really want to be from a literally waking up in the middle of the night and evacuating perspective, you want to have that bag ready. You're not going to have time to defend your home, most likely in the case of a wildfire evacuation. So for wildfire, it's typically a very sudden response that you'll need to make to it. And so, right, that's why you want to, any structural defenses or any structural resiliency measures you want to take, you do those in the weeks and months leading up to wildfire season for your region. There's not a whole lot you can do sort of once that fire is already burning in your area.
Yep, that's right. Let's see any other questions that we have for Dr. Hope. And I just want to also remind our attendees that we have a whole section about wildfire on our Adventist Risk website. It has a lot of great resources. It talks about some of the items that Dr. Hope went over today. So I encourage you to check it out. And if we don't have any other questions, we are about 5 minutes to an hour. So thank you so much, Dr. Hope, for taking the time to be with us today. And we appreciate all of the attendees and people that joined us for this webinar. And I wish you guys a great afternoon, and I will see you later.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.